What's going on? Welcome to this amplifier kit installation video. If you've been wondering how to install an amp kit so that you can add a subwoofer to your sound system, I'm going to show you how to do just that in this video. I'm going to go over the amp kit that I chose and why, how to set up the fuse, how to get the battery cable in the cabin, and I'm going to share a lot of tips along the way. What I have here is an amplifier wiring kit, and regardless of which amplifier you end up getting, you're going to need an amp kit because the amplifier is going to draw a lot of current, so it needs wires of the appropriate gauge to handle that expected power output of the amplifier. The amp kit is the bedrock of the system, so it's important not to cheap out here, and there's a lot of very low quality options that may end up being a headache. Some will even advertise a certain gauge, but they actually have very thick insulators that will effectively lower the amperage that they can handle. These premium kits will use high quality insulators that have good flexibility. They may also include oxygen-free copper or OFC, and those are conductors with increased conductivity that also have increased resistance to oxidation over time. Although if we're speaking honestly, the difference is negligible for our purposes, and OFC is mostly a marketing gimmick, but it's usually found in high quality amp kits as a whole, which is what we should use for the installation anyways. This particular amp kit is made by Kicker. It's a 4 gauge, and when you consider the size of the amp kit to get, generally I would recommend 8 gauge for outputting 400 watts RMS or under, but if you're close, I would go with a 4 gauge like I did so that you have room to grow if you want to install stronger equipment in the future. 4 gauge is good for up to 1000 watts RMS, which is good enough for most casual installations. Just be sure to get the proper gauge kit that can handle the current going through it so that the power cable doesn't get hot or even catch on fire. It's also not a good idea to be pushing your equipment to its limits consistently, so it's better to get more than what you need than less in that regard. The first cable right here is the power cable, and it's going to be long enough to run from the battery to the trunk of most cars. But if you're concerned about the length, make sure that you measure your car ahead of time and get a kit with a cable that's long enough for you. The ground cable is much shorter and it's going to be installed close to the components. You'll notice that both cables are the same gauge, which is important and something to consider if you're building your own kit separately. You'll also get a remote cable that will serve as your turn on signal for the amp. You'll get a fuse box with a fuse already inside of it, and I'll show you how to install this momentarily. You'll get a self-tapping screw for the ground cable, which you may or may not need. You'll get a grommet to use if you're drilling through your firewall to get the power cable inside the car and protect it from chafing. And depending on the kit you get, you may get zip ties, butt connectors, or other accessories. Now, because I already had RCA cables, I got the kit without them to save me money. But if you don't have RCA cables, make sure that you buy a kit that includes them or buy them separately. The RCA cable is going to feed the amp its low-level input either from a head unit or from a line-out converter. If you're using speaker level connections instead, you're not going to need the RCA cables. And if you're confused about any of this, don't worry. All of this will become clear as this installation progresses. So let me show you the power inputs to the amp. And this is going to be the case for just about every amplifier out there. You're going to have a ground connection, you're going to have a remote connection, and a battery input. And those are the 3 main cables that we got on the amp kit that I just showed you. The remote cable right here is going to take 12 volts of power from the head unit, and we're going to connect it to the remote input right here. The sole purpose of this cable is to turn the amplifier on and off because you don't want the amplifier drawing current from your battery when the car is off. So this cable is going to tap into a switch power source from the head unit. In other words, a source that only supplies 12 volts when the car is on or the ignition switch is in the accessory position. Of course, your battery cable is going to end up plugged in right there in the battery input, and the same thing with the ground cable right here. Now, the installation of this fuse is probably the most important part of this install because in the event that the battery cable conductor shorted by making contact with the chassis of the car, this fuse would blow and it would break the circuit. Without the fuse, if that were to happen, it would be the equivalent of you shorting the battery terminals and the cable would likely get hot very quickly, maybe even catch on fire. Of course, this is only likely in the event of an accident, but that's what the fuse is there for. The entirety of the cable after the fuse is protected, and that's the reason why the fuse is installed so close to the battery. The fuse is there for your protection, not for the equipment. You shouldn't overlook it. Make sure you install the fuse. The kit tells you exactly where to install it. You can use some large diagonal cutters to easily and cleanly cut the cable right at that mark, and if you're left with a braided sleeve, you can make short work of it for a cleaner look by simply using a razor or even diagonal cutters to get rid of it. When you're satisfied, open up the fuse holder and measure the cable so that you know just how much of the shield to cut off, and then grab a razor blade to cut through the shield. At this point, it's pretty easy to apply too much pressure and cut the actual strands of the conductor, so go slow and rotate the cable as you go, and that's going to allow you to stop just shy of the strands. Then you can simply bend the tip until the shield comes off. You'll need an Allen wrench to loosen the terminal on top, and to get the cable in, it helps to twist the strands together since the opening is made to fit the wire snugly. Once in, finish it off by fully tightening the Allen screw on top, and to see if you did a good job, give the cable a really good tug while holding that fuse box. It shouldn't move at all, and that's going to be your cue to move to the other side. You'll notice some holes inside the fuse holder, and those are there to secure the box to the chassis of the car with screws if you choose to do so. With that fuse installed, you can start routing the battery cable, but before you get started, make sure you disconnect the negative battery terminal to prevent the possible shorts as you work with these cables throughout the car. The next step is scoping out how to route the battery cable, and there's going to be several cables already running through the firewall into the inside of the car, and the cables will be protected with thick rubber grommets. You can see them all over the place here. You'll have to look around the engine bay and find the most convenient route in, while being mindful where the cable is going to end up inside. That's sometimes going to be based on where the battery cable is going, and in some cars, drilling through the firewall might actually be necessary, but I would only recommend that as a last resort because in most cars, you could usually find a grommet that you can use if you look hard enough. For my 2020 STI, I knew I wanted the battery cable under the passenger seat, so I decided to run it through a grommet under the passenger side wheel well, which is in my opinion the easiest way inside for the WRX or the STI. Now, I'm going to show you how to make this run on the passenger side, but the process is the same on the driver's side. First, you have to remove the two pop clips holding this inside fender cover. That'll allow you to tuck the battery cable out of the way to secure it, and it's also a pretty good spot to hide your fuse box and permanently attach it. I didn't want to drill onto the chassis of the car with screws, so I simply used 3M tape to secure the box in place. If you do this, just make sure that you clean both surfaces where the 3M tape will go with alcohol, and that when you place the box down, you apply good pressure for a few seconds to set that 3M tape. When done, the fuse will be out of sight and out of mind. The terminal connector is going to fit perfectly on that top stud of the battery's positive terminal. Simply remove that nut up there with a 12mm wrench and place the battery cable's terminal connector over it. Angle the cable however you wish, and of course secure it in place by replacing that nut. You're going to find that the terminal cover is not going to fit properly over the amp cable after that. So what I did was I simply cut a square off of the soft plastic with diagonal cutters and a sharp razor blade. That made a hole just the right size for the cable to run through, and now the cover snaps properly back into place and it looks good. The rest of the cable can be routed along the firewall and zip tied to existing cables. I ended up changing my mind about this, and I'm going to show you what I did, but this is certainly an option if you wish. So let me show you where the cable will run. Start by removing the inside fender cover on the passenger side this time. You have to get behind this plastic cover right here, which is simply held in place with pop clips. You'll have to remove the 6 clips that I circled on here to have enough room behind there to work with. For these clips with the screw heads, simply rotate that inner pin with a Phillips screwdriver, and then you can pop them out with a clip removal tool like this one. The other ones are your standard pop clips, and they shouldn't give you much trouble to come out, but over time, some of these exterior clips can become brittle and just break off. So make sure that you have replacements handy. In the video description, there's a link to a good kit that I use, so check that out if you're interested. Now we can route the cable in the engine bay through the top of the wheel well so that it comes out by the tire, and then we can route it into this very convenient grommet hiding in there. This is what it looks like when it's done. It's neat, it's out of the way, and it's secure. You have to cut a slit on the grommet with a razor, just big enough for the cable, and then push the cable right through. You should also zip tie the cable to that existing bundle in there, just like you see right here, so that the cable doesn't move around when you're driving. Now let me show you where the cable comes in on the inside. If you need to know how to remove this glove box and the frame, check out a separate how-to video that I did, which I'll link up above and in the video description. You can see right here how cleanly the cable comes in, and now we can finish routing it through the car. I used an existing cable pathway to secure the cable, and it runs along the door sill, under the carpet, and then under the passenger seat where I need it. Regardless of where you route it, make sure that at no point the cable is loose enough to rattle, so use zip ties to secure it tightly against existing cables. There is one final thing about the battery cable that I want to mention. If at any point you run the cable over a sharp edge like this, you should protect it against chafing. I just grabbed some thick rubber that I had laying around and some zip ties, but you could use wire loom or get creative in your own way. This is to provide some protection for the cable and some peace of mind for you. So after installing an air oil separator, I decided that I didn't want the cable running along the firewall, so I went ahead and put it on the other side. Like I mentioned earlier, the install is just the reverse, and you can see the cable through the grommet on the driver's side here instead. If you choose this side, the cable comes out very conveniently right there by this kick plate, and then you can route the cable however you wish from there. If you have an aftermarket head unit, you'll have to run the RCA cables from behind the head unit to wherever you installed your amplifiers. And that's also where you'll tap into that accessory wire that I mentioned earlier. This is your 12 volts that the amp will use to turn on and off. This is not the power source for the amp. The power source is that 4-gauge cable that we just installed. Every car is different, so you have to dig up the stereo wiring diagram of your particular car and find that accessory wire. Here you can see that mine is tapped into the accessory wire of this breakout harness that I made. This harness plugs into the head unit and then into the plugs on the car side, and then the wire just runs behind the glove box, and it's zip tied to existing cables on its way to under the passenger seat. Now let's go over the ground cable. So I'm installing the amplifiers under the passenger seat, and unlike the battery cable, the ground cable is short and it should be installed close to the amplifiers. And also keep in mind that if you're installing multiple components like I'll be installing 2 amps and a line out converter, you should ground them all at the same location. That's going to prevent ground loops, which can cause humming and rob the system of clarity, so it's very important. Most amp kits are going to include a properly sized self-tapping screw that you can use to drill into the chassis of the car and make your own ground point if you need to. But most of the time you can find an existing bolt that can serve as a perfect ground point, like this bolt right here, which is what I used. That said, it is imperative that the ground connection is solid metal and not paint, so it might be necessary to use a drill or Dremel tool to expose that metal. This is a critical part of the install, and it's where a lot of people go wrong. But if you take your time and make sure your ground is solid now, you'll save yourself the need to have to troubleshoot noise issues later. And that's how you basically install an amp kit. It's a pretty straightforward install, but now I'm ready to install my components and enjoy a premium music listening experience out of my mediocre sound system. Be sure to check out the rest of the videos in this series so that you can see the completed product. And if you appreciate the video, why not give it a like and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next video. Take care.